Dr. Shawn Baker. Carnivore diet's not for everybody. So who would be those people?
Oh, well, I mean, obviously, if you don't like meat, that would make it challenging. I think it makes sense to talk about who would best benefit from it, and then to say if you're not in those group, why do you do it? If you're healthy and happy and doing well, and why change it? I don't see. I know there's people that do it just to try it for a fad. I'm not sure how much benefits you're going to get. So I think the people that most likely are to benefit are people who are sick, where they have autoimmune disease, cardiometabolic disease, obesity, food addiction, mental health issues. I think those people definitely can benefit from that. But if you don't fall into those categories, and unfortunately, less and less people don't fall into those categories as more and more people get sick, I think if you are, certain athletes, if you are doing well as an athlete and well adapted to using a lot of carbohydrates for your performance, you don't necessarily need to do that. I think that there are people that, this is obviously we're in the U.S., but there's parts of the world where it literally is cost prohibitive. If you go to different parts of the world, meat is not as accessible. So those people they're going to struggle with it for sure. Little kids, I don't think there's a reason for kids to do it. If you got a kid who's profoundly sick, most little kids aren't, but there's probably a little reason for a kid. I think kids should eat meat for sure. I think kids should eat a lot of animal products, and they can include other sources of energy on top of that because they're in a rapid growth phase, and so you want to make sure you're getting adequate calories for that. High quality calories, and we get a lot of. Their childhood obesity is, through the roof. We're like 20-something% right now, and that's just a lot of excess calories with no nutrition in them. But I think, for the people that don't want to do this, I think probably if we look at the American population, maybe half the population could potentially benefit from it. Maybe the other half wouldn't.
Yeah. So at that point, it just becomes a matter of preference if you're in that other half, right? If it's just, okay, I like this diet, I like to eat this kind of stuff.
I put a link down below for my really good friend Shawn's company, Bubs Naturals. They have the only Whole30 approved C8, C10 MCT oil powder. Now, this company is near and dear to me. Those of you that know me know I work a lot with special operations. I work with special forces. Bubs Naturals is a company that was built in honor of Glenn Doherty, whose call sign was Bub. So if you remember the whole Benghazi thing in Libya, he gave his life up for all the Americans there. So he's a very important person to those that are in the special operations community. And 10% of all profits from Bubs Naturals go to charity in Glenn Doherty's name. That being said, they're also amazing products. So they're collagen, they're creamers, but in this case, they're MCT powder. Put it in my tea, I scoop. I usually just dry scoop it because it tastes good. But anyway, that code Thomas20 is a 20% off discount link. And even if you don't use MCT oil, know that it's for a really good cause and something that I truly stand behind. So that link is in the top line of the description underneath this video.
The mental health piece, I want to talk on that for a second because I was just out in Scottsdale, I interviewed Michaela Peterson, and it was such an interesting discussion with her because candidly, I was expecting her to be pretty dogmatic about it, and she was not at all. She explained, her struggles with her mental health, and that this has just been the one thing that has essentially kept her sane. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like you've seen that quite a bit. Do you, outside of just, hey, I've had this experience with this, do you have any potential mechanistic explanation as to why? Is it a ketone thing? Is it an elimination thing? Like is it the addition of ketones being present, or is the elimination of other things? What's your take on that?
Well, I think the honest answer is there's probably multiple things that are at play. We know, for instance, if we look at the various different mental health illnesses, for one, like for instance, carnitine, carnitine deficiency or relative carnitine deficiency has been shown to be associated with a major depressive disorder. There was a nice 2018 paper out of Stanford that shows that who tends to be low in carnitine? People that don't eat much meat. So we see that pretty commonly in the people that are vegetarian, vegan, really quite honestly, the U.S. standard omnivore diet, which is only about 2 ounces of red meat. It's interesting, the average American eats about 2.4 ounces of beef, which is not very much. So we have all these issues. B12 has been associated with those types of things. I think that gut inflammation, leads to brain inflammation in a way. We see leaky gut, leaky brain. We see, Chris Palmer's done some great work around mitochondrial health with this regard. I think, zinc, iron, those types of things are replete in a meat-based diet. So those things could all contribute to that. I think the fact that you're, like you mentioned, ketones. So, the ketones tend to be a more stable source of energy. And so you don't have those energy vacillations that you might see on a more carbohydrate-based diet where you're eating and, having higher and lower glucose, throughout the day. And I think your brain is affected by that. And so we see that mood often stabilizes when energy stabilizes, which makes sense. You see, you've got kids. If you load your kids up on sugar, they're bouncing off the walls for a couple hours and then they're crashing and then they may be irritable. And I think we just see that expressed in adults. And we see now 1/3 of, teenagers and young adults are affected with some sort of mental health disorder. So it's, clearly we have a food supply that is harmful to us. What that exactly is it sugar? Is it ultra processed food? Is it oils? Those are all controversial things. But clearly removing some of those things, what I would just consider basically poisons, or as somebody likes to call, I saw this called as a lot of this ultra processed food is almost like a recreational drug. I think that really is a good way to look at these things. And I know there's some people who argue that, well, ultra processing isn't necessarily bad. We can look at protein powders and things like that. But by and large, the majority of the ultra processed food that's in the store is not particularly good for us. So I think all of those things combine to help the brain out. The brain, it's interesting because 5 years ago you talked about nutrition and mental health and people thought you were absolutely crazy. It's clearly trauma or some deficiency in serotonin or something like that. And now we're finding out that nutrition has a tremendous role in depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, PTSD even. I've seen it with ADHD. I've seen it with Tourette syndrome. We see it with addiction. These are some of the things I see very commonly. People that are alcoholics, cigarette, addicted to cigarettes, recreational drugs. They go on a low carb, ketogenic, and often a carnivore diet, and they just lose the cravings for that stuff. So clearly, it's multifactorial.
Yeah. That was going to be my next question, was on like alcohol withdrawal syndrome and just alcoholism in general, because Chris Palmer's done some great stuff there.
Have you talked to Chris? Have you?
I have, yeah. And I guess if we could later on in this in the edit, we could cut to a little clip of him talking about the mitochondrial piece. I think that'd be a good place to insert just for a minute or two.
The more I dove into the science of, well, what exactly is type 2 diabetes? Like, what causes it at the cellular level? What causes obesity at the cellular level? Like, how are those things connected? And how are those two things connected with mental illness? That was probably the biggest aha moment. All of that led me to these tiny things in our cells called mitochondria. That helped me understand metabolism and metabolic disorders. But it also, for the first time in my career, helped me understand mental disorders. And I could start to connect the dots. So the common denominator actually gets really complicated. So the common denominator is mitochondria. But when you do a deep dive into the science of mitochondria, this field has exploded over the last 20 years. So most people know mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell. Mm-hmm. They take food and oxygen and they turn it into ATP, or power. And they do that. But actually they do way more than that. And that is the cutting edge area of research that helped me connect the dots. It turns out that mitochondria play a direct role in neurotransmitter production and regulation. Like neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. It turns out it plays an important role in inflammation, turning it on and off. They play a role in the regulation of gene expression in the nucleus. They play a role, here's the thing, they play a role in the human stress response. Psychological stress, trauma, adverse childhood events, they play a role in helping the human body orchestrate the stress response to defend itself, to help you fight or flee, to help you cope with adversity. But it turns out adversity also has an impact on mitochondria and mitochondrial function. And once I understood all of that, that was the first time in my career that I could start to say, whoa, this is like the missing link. Because we know all of those things play a role in mental illness. And this is the way to put it all together.
But essentially, presence of ketones, the acetate, and kind of having acetate, which is essentially when ethanol is metabolized, you have acetate that enters the mitochondria. So you're getting another form with acetoacetate and that cleavage there. Basically, someone that's a functioning alcoholic that feels like they only feel normal when they drink alcohol can essentially get a similar feeling if they're producing ketones. More work needs to be done there, but it's pretty fascinating. And it's like, wow. I mean, and you look at the alcohol withdrawal side, I can speak from the ketogenic side, not necessarily the carnivore side. A lot of people, I mean, easily dozens that I've encountered personally and probably hundreds that I've seen in comments, the only way that they could kick alcohol was by being on a ketogenic diet. Mm-hmm. And so I have a hard time determining if it's the elimination of things as far as with addiction is concerned, or if there is an effect with beta-hydroxybutyrate. But very interesting.
Yeah, I'm sure mechanistically it's both. And it's kind of interesting because when I lived here in California before I moved, next door to me was like a halfway house for women that were struggling with drug and alcohol addiction. And they were just constantly eating garbage. And it was just like, how can you recover when all you're eating is pizza and, drinking Coca-Colas all day? It was just fascinating to me that we don't, you check into some fancy rehab center and they feed you garbage. So why don't they clean up the diet?
Yeah, I mean, you're essentially potentially replacing one addiction with another anyway. I mean, you're sure there's a physical piece with alcohol that's possibly a little bit different than lighting up your brain like a Christmas tree with ultra processed foods, but there's still something there, that same dopamine hit maybe, perhaps in a different way. Let's talk about the foods on carnivore, because you're much more of a fan of just the meat specifically. Are you a big organ meat person, or are you just straight up, choice cuts, kind of just give me the steak?
Yeah, I mean, with regard to the organ meats, I'm certainly not against organ meats. I don't particularly care for them, to be honest. I mean, that's just personal preference, I suppose. Again, as we mentioned, I think earlier, talking about energy demands. So I think if you're going to do a carnivore diet, you need adequate fat in your diet. Now, how much that is, whether it's 80% of your calories or 60% of your calories, somewhere in that range. And so certain cuts, I couldn't do a carnivore diet if all I ate was bottom sirloin. I mean, or bottom round. I mean, I would literally starve to death. So there has to be an adequate amount of fat to do that. I think that, there's been this sort of, overemphasis on organs in some way. I mean, the way I learned about a carnivore diet, and I certainly didn't invent the diet. I mean, there were people talking about this years before me, and even you go back to the 1700s with James Rollo, a Scottish surgeon, talking about treating diabetes with all meat diets. So it's been around for a long time. But the people that had done it 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and when they talked about organ meats, they said, we really don't feel they're necessary. We don't eat them. And I mean, that's just, again, we'll talk about Stefanson. He did an interview in 1957 when he was, in his 70s, talking about his time in the Arctic, and he basically said, we didn't really eat them much, and we gave them to the dogs. Occasionally, we'd eat some kidneys, from on special occasions. So I don't find them to be absolutely necessary. Now, I will, a lot of this is anecdotal. I do see people that will say, I feel better when I eat some organ meats, and I say go for that. But again, Harvard study, the 2021 study that Ludwig, Leonards, and others did, showed that the addition or subtraction of organ meats didn't really have a positive or negative outcome. So it's just like, I think it's preference. But I do think that in the absence of carbohydrates, you got to get energy from somewhere. And protein's not a good source of energy. I mean, you can turn it into it, but it's not optimal.
Have you found with carnivore that eggs and dairy seem to kind of muddy the water a little bit? Do they seem to cause issues with people as being, I don't want to call them potentially inflammatory, because that's just kind of a vague way of putting it. But if someone's doing, say, animal-based versus strict carnivore, and they're adding eggs and they're adding raw cream and they're adding kefir and things like that, do you think that's good or bad?
Well, again, I think it's individual. I think that I do see people with certain autoimmune inflammatory disease where they have to eliminate all that stuff for a period of time, do the quote unquote, as you mentioned, Michaela's lion diet, which, I just call that a carnivore autoimmune diet. But yeah, for some people, for sure. I mean, I variably consume eggs and dairy and things like that. I kind of go through phases where I'll go on an egg kick for a while, and I'll eat a lot of eggs. I'll eat, throw down a dozen at a time. as you know, I'm a big guy, and so that's something I see. But I do see people with varying types of, not all dairy is the same. There's a difference between, say, ghee and, skim milk. I mean, I think there's clear differences there. And I think some people react to some of the protein, some don't. I think probably more so dairy than eggs. I mean, just looking at the numbers I've seen over the years. So again, if you're doing this diet, you should be doing it hopefully to fix a health issue. And I think you just do it you just be as objective as possible. Say, what happens when I add these foods? What happens when I delete these foods? And objectively figure out what's going on there. Because whenever I see somebody struggling with something, I'll say, hey, try eliminating dairy, try eliminating eggs next, perhaps try eliminating coffee if that's an issue for you. Most people don't need to do that, quite honestly, but there are some people that do.
Do you find that there's a number of people when they do carnivore for a period of time to sort of fix these metabolic issues, they get themselves to a state where they're no longer metabolically deranged and they can start to add in some of these other foods again? I mean, do you see that happen?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I encourage people to try that. I mean, I think I don't know what the period is, 3 months, 6 months, but for some people maybe a year, until they're metabolically in a better place. They're not as insulin resistant, or they handle their energy better. They're not obese anymore. I mean, there's this is one of the interesting things. Somebody will start 300 pounds and they'll be eating X amount of food, and then they'll drop to 250, and they're like, well, why am I not losing weight anymore? I'm still eating the same food. Well, you're literally 50 pounds lighter. You got to make these adjustments. And so I think that for sure people can add things. I encourage people to, and that's, I'll just mention our company, Rivero. I mean, that's what we do. I mean, we literally take people, we transition them in, we figure out what degree of elimination they need to do. Once they become healthy, we encourage people to start reintroducing food, because this has to be sustainable over the lifetime. And I think one of the things, we don't, some people don't even believe this is a phenomenon, but food addiction, which I think clearly occurs. I think there's people that are addicted to chocolate, ice cream, whatever. I mean, I think that clearly happens. And you have to get these people to really change their relationship with the food before you can do anything. You just have to fix that. If you don't fix that, they're always going to go back to that. And that takes some time. And I think an elimination diet where you just, if you had an alcoholic, you're not going to tell them, hey, just go out on the weekends and have a margarita or two. It's not going to work for them. So you have to have this strict elimination period of time, and then at some point they probably can start to moderate. But I mean, a lot of the food out there is, I'm not going to tell anybody to go back to eating Snickers bars and Ben & Jerry's ice cream. That's not going to be something I'm going to recommend ever for somebody. Now, if somebody wants to do that occasionally, and I've said that every once in a while I'll have a piece of cake on my kid's birthday or something like that, but it's not. I'm not encouraging people to do that. If you understand the difference, if somebody wants to add in some blueberries and some fruit and some rice and some sweet potatoes and whole single foods, I don't really have any problem with that at all.
What's you've got a lot of people in the animal-based carnivore world that get pretty loud and pretty dogmatic at times. Why do you think that is? Because I talk to you and you have a very level approach on this. You're not coming at it from, I think sometimes you get painted in an incorrect light. I'll come right out and say that. I've said many times to people that I think you're one of the kindest people that I've met, and that you've never tried to push it down my throat or anything like that. But why do you think it is that people get so loud about it? Is it because I've always kind of likened it to like a band, like you go through a period of depression and a band kind of gets you through that, your favorite metal band, and then you're like indebted to the band, and then the lead singer leaves and goes, and you just get all upset and you're loud about it. Why do you think that is? Because I think sometimes that scares people off. I mean, I don't know if you agree or not, but there's a lot of people that I feel would benefit from doing carnivore that don't want to do it because you've got these loud people that are just so angry.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly some tribalism that's occurring, and you're on your team, and when somebody attacks a member of your team, you want to defend them back, and I think part of that is some of it's a defense mechanism, because this is something that's obviously going against the grain. It's going against a lot of medical advice. It's like, oh my God, you're eating all this saturated fat, you're going to kill everybody. So you're constantly fighting that off. So I think you're already just in a defensive posture in a way. And it's just like, And people often, they feel like they've been lied to, they've been cheated, they spent decades trying to figure out some health problems, and they make a simple dietary switch, and they're like, all my health problems got better. And so it's almost like they have a religious experience, and they want to proselytize to everybody else, and so they become maybe overly dogmatic about that. I mean, I try to, as someone who is, I guess, a top figure within this space, try to not do that. I mean, I goof around and play, and as social media is, it's just entertainment for a lot of purposes. But I think that we have people that are telling you like, you're going to die because you're doing this, and it's easy to get defensive with that, and it's like or you don't know what you're talking about, and there is a lot of just over extrapolation of what we actually know, because I don't think we know that much. I mean, I was criticized the other day for saying I don't know the long-term outcomes of a carnivore diet, because I just don't. I mean, I don't think anybody knows. I don't think you can say the long-term outcomes of any diet, quite honestly, because we can't rigorously test that. But I mean, I'm like, I do know that I can get someone who's sick and make them healthier, from this year to next year. So I think that's valuable. And then I think the arguments start coming around about like trying to predict the future. And I'm like, I don't know. I really don't know. And there's people that claim they do. I mean, there's people that will criticize me within the carnivore space for being too wishy-washy. Like, well, you're too wishy-washy about, like, I'm like, I'm fine for myself. I mean, I'm fine to take risks for myself, but I'm not going to take that risk for everybody else and tell them, hey, ignore cholesterol. Just do that. So I just can't do that. I don't think it's appropriate.
Well, I mean, you have an oath as a physician too. You can't exactly just say, hey, I willy-nilly do whatever you want.
Right. And I mean, to be fair, I mean, my social media is not a doctor-patient relationship, but at the same time, I'm out there, promoting this quite heavily, and I think it's beneficial for a lot of people. And it's interesting, because going back to the biggest concern is, am I going to develop heart disease? Because my LDL went up, and I honestly tell the people, I really don't know the answer to that. I think you can do things to sort of, monitor that over time, which is what I do. I mean, I get calcium scans and serial calcium scans just to make sure. But at the same time, when I talk to people, and I've talked to some people that were in pretty dire straits. I mean, multiple sclerosis, or where they could barely get out of bed, or Crohn's disease, where they're on the toilet 20 times a day with bloody diarrhea in their life. They're literally miserable, and they literally go back to being a normal human being. And you ask them, hey, what about if your heart disease risk went up? And they will tell you, I don't really care, because I couldn't live that way. I couldn't live that way with such crippling mental health, or whatever it might be. So it's just as long as they understand that, maybe there's some risk associated with this. And they're willing to accept that, I think that's fine. Then you do that, and you mitigate the risk, you examine the risk, you test the risk, and that's all you can really do. But to sit there and say carnivore is going to make me live to be 100 years of age, or not have cancer, or never have heart disease, I have no clue, and I don't think anybody does.
And what's your take on vegetables? Do you think they are toxic? Do you think they're poisonous?
Well, I mean. Yes and no. Yes, there's compounds that are problematic for people. I mean, in high enough dose. And again, it's the dose makes the poison. And clearly there are people on Earth that have eaten vegetables throughout their life, and they live long, healthy lives. So, clearly it's not an acute toxin for most people. Now, do I see people that eliminate vegetables from their diet and their health gets better? Yeah, absolutely. So I think for some people, and why might that be? It might be we're living in a time where we're exposed to such toxic food, toxic environmental exposures, that our guts have become so damaged that now we can no longer tolerate something that we should be able to tolerate, perhaps. And maybe it's microbiome, maybe it's whatever, gut dysbiosis or permeability issues. So I don't like vegetables. I'll just be honest with you. I never liked them as a kid. I only grudgingly ate them as an adult. When I did keto, I was doing the Mark Sisson big ass salads, where I get a pound bag of spinach, and I throw eggs and bacon and some olive oil and balsamic vinegar and some nuts on there, and gobble that down. And I didn't like the salad part. I like the toppings, but if you just sit down with just a plain bowl of spinach, you'd be like, oh, this isn't good. So I never liked them.
I haven't found a lot of people that like a plain bowl of leaves without
anything,
putting
without fat
something
on it.
Right. So it's, and I like my vegetables personally. I people know that about me. It's not like I go out of my way.
Can you eat like raw cauliflower?
I was just going to say exact things like that. Like,
like
I have no desire to go eat raw cauliflower, and I do have rules for myself. I hardly ever eat raw vegetables. I don't. Like if I do, I cook them, and that's just because like I'm not going to eat raw Brussels sprouts, but I do love some roasted Brussels sprouts, right? But
that was, interestingly, Brussels sprouts were the last vegetable I ate in 2016. The last time I had a vegetable was a Brussels sprout in France. So it's a fun fact.
Before we wrap this up, I want to talk just lipid energy model for just a second, not even in the sake of cholesterol and whatnot, but there are a lot of people in specifically the animal-based world, and I think we all kind of know one particular figure that kind of makes some claims that calories essentially don't even matter because you're going to self-govern and kind of regulate when you're eating sort of a whole food diet. Personally, I can tell you my position on it. I feel like that could be true up to a degree for maybe a metabolically healthy person. But there's also a lot of people that'll say if someone is in the carnivore community, they're a calorie denier, someone that doesn't believe in thermodynamics. I'm just curious your take on that. Because
calories are, I know there's people that want to use mass as a unit instead of calories, whatever. But ultimately, there's Mike Keys and some of these guys who talk about this stuff. But ultimately, there's either more food or less food. And however you want to, if you want to count atoms or you want to count calories, it doesn't really matter. If I want to gain weight on a carnivore diet, I got to eat more food. If I want to lose weight on a carnivore diet, I got to eat less food. That's just, and I've been doing this for 8 years, Now, if I want to eat, is there a difference between me eating 2,000 calories of steak and 2,000 calories of donuts? Yes, there are hormonal differences. There are, different changes in all kinds of things. Appetite regulation. This is why we have these, GLP-1 receptor agonists. This drug is revolutionizing obesity management, but it's a hormonal drug. So clearly it's not, how many calories are in an Ozempic shot, right? It's not, it's right. It's about hormones. So hormones definitely play a role here, but to say that calories or some volume of food, however you want to contract that, is irrelevant. Now, a lot of people go carnivore and they don't need to count calories and they just intuitively, eat less or their appetite's better. And, and as you know, protein has an additional thermic effect. So you could potentially eat more calories, particularly when you're increasing your protein than you were before, and actually lose weight. I think that makes sense metabolically, just from a physics standpoint. But to say that calories don't matter is probably not accurate. But to say that they're the only thing that matters, which a lot of people will talk about, is also, in my view, not accurate.
Yeah, that's exactly where I stand on it too. And I think this study comes up all the time about the Bethesda, Maryland, and Madison, Wisconsin rhesus monkey study, where essentially from a longevity perspective, reducing calories only really mattered when the diet was crap.
Yeah. I think again, we talk about these people that are calorie, these people that live on, 800 calories a day for years and years and years to aid in longevity. I think, Rob Wolf has a pretty good take on this, and I'm sure you know Rob, but he's chronic reduction of calories is beneficial if you're obese, right? But once you're lean, you need to eat. You need to eat enough to fuel your stuff.
Definitely. I've learned that the hard way too, recovery and everything. Well, Dr. Baker, where can everyone find you, man?
So you can go on Instagram, Shawn Baker 1967, Twitter or X, S Baker MD, YouTube, Shawn Baker MD, TikTok, Shawn Baker MD, Rivero.com, and carnivore.diet.
Perfect. Well, thank you, my man, and see you guys later.